Días. Hoy nos visita Federico Picinali, profesor asistente en la London School of Economics. Federico viene de la Universidad de Milano inicialmente y después tiene estudios de posgrado en Yale y en Trento, donde hizo su doctorado. Y bueno, enseña Derecho Penal y Derecho Probatorio en la London School of Economics y ha trabajado sobre varias cuestiones relacionadas con el razonamiento probatorio, como prueba estadística, estándares de prueba. Actualmente está trabajando sobre cuestiones relacionadas con la injusticia epistémica y hoy nos viene a presentar su reciente libro, un libro del 2022, que es Justice in Between, que concierne a la posibilidad de veredictos intermedios o un tercer veredicto en el derecho penal. Así que Federico, muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación y tu tiempo.
Grazie a tutti per essere qua. If you don't mind, I will give my presentation in English, okay? For a number of reasons, but I'll promise I'll be slow, and you can interrupt me anytime if there's anything you don't understand. In fact, I would very much like it if, rather than doing the usual where the speaker gives the talk and then you have a Q&A, if you wanted to interrupt me with questions about the content of what I've said, that would be absolutely fine. I would be happy with that. So first of all, I would like to thank Diego and Jordi for inviting me to come here. It's always a pleasure, especially if you come from the United Kingdom, which at this time of year is generally wet and cold. So for me to sit on the bench in the sun just before getting into this building was really refreshing. So if anything, thanks for that moment of pleasure. And I wasn't expecting such a big turnout. I'm really, really humbled, and I thank you all for coming here. I hope it is going to be a useful talk and seminar for you. And I know that Diego has circulated the PDFs of the book. I don't expect you to have read the whole thing. It actually takes a bit of time to do it, and perhaps you found it contrived or boring and you decided to give up early on in the book. But if you stay with it, I hope you will get something from reading it. What I'll try to do today is just to give you a bird's eye view of the book. So I will make some introductory considerations, then I will go through each chapter, basically tell you what happens in each chapter. Obviously, I can only scratch the surface of what's in the book, because the presentation is meant to be relatively short, but I'll be very happy in the Q&A to go more into the details of some of the arguments and some of the chapters if you want to do so. One last thing to say about the book is that, in my view, the chapters are self-contained. What do I mean by this? I mean that if you don't want to read the whole thing, you would still be able to read chapters individually and get something out of them, even if you don't have a sense of the whole picture. I think this applies to every chapter, perhaps with the exclusion of chapter 5, which contains objections to some of the arguments that I present in earlier chapters. So please look at the table of contents, find what interests you, and feel free to read that part of the book only, perhaps with the introduction before it, so at least to get a sense of the entire book. Great. So let me start by giving a definition of an intermediate criminal verdict. An intermediate criminal verdict is, or at least this is the definition I adopt in the book, a decision characterized by a less demanding standard of proof than that required for any required conviction, and by the imposition of milder hard treatment than that involved in conviction. And when I talk about hard treatment, I'm not referring exclusively to legal consequences, such as fine or imprisonment, but also social consequences, such as social stigma. So understood with these two components, an intermediate criminal verdict can be understood as implementation of the logic, weaker evidence than that required for conviction, milder and harder treatment than that involved in conviction. Or in short, weaker evidence, milder, harder treatment. Okay? And a system that adopts an intermediate verdict instead departs from the traditional binary setup, according to which, at the end of the trial, you only have two available options: to acquit or to convict. Okay? Now, the picture that you see on this slide is a painting from a Dutch painter, Matthias Stom, that depicts a famous biblical tale, which is that of King Solomon, or Solomon's judgment. And I think there are some interesting points of contact that perhaps we could discuss later, between Solomon's judgment on the one hand and the idea of an intermediate verdict. Although my view is that in the case of Solomon never really intended to deliver the intermediate option, in other words, to cut the half. Rather, it presented the intermediate option as a sort of a stratagem to figure out which of the two binary options would be the right one. Okay, so in this sense, I think there's an important difference there. But anyway, we might come back to this later. So, in the book, I attempt to justify the adoption of an intermediate verdict. So the question that I ask is that of the justification of intermediate verdict. Why study this problem at all? Why does it matter? And what is it that motivated me to study this question? There are a number of reasons that I lay out in the introduction to the book. So I'm going to go through them in turn. But first of all, the intermediate criminal verdicts feature prominently in the history and in the present of the law. And I'm going to say more about this in the next slide. Secondly, my intention was that of overcoming a certain dogmatism about the binary verdict system. Okay? So I don't know if this applies to textbooks in Spain or in Latin America, but certainly if you open a random criminal procedure or evidence law textbook in England and Wales, you would be hard-pressed to find a justification for the binary system. No words will be spent on attempting to justify the fact that we only have two options at the end of the trial. Why so? I presume this is because scholars tend to take it for granted that the binary system is justified. Perhaps they think that the reasons for the binary system are so obvious that they don't need spelling out. And in the book I take issue with this stance. And I argue, well, no, they're not obvious at all. And I'll try to show you that they're not. So my attempt is precisely to try and overcome this dogmatism. And notice that there are two possible, equally valuable, I would say, outcomes of this kind of project. One might be able to provide a justification for an intermediate verdict, which in other words is a way of showing that the binary system is not justified. But even if the outcome were the opposite, that, in other words, of showing that the binary system is indeed justified, that intermediate criminal verdicts cannot be justified, well, that too would be a way of overcoming this dogmatism, because it would be a way of unveiling a justification that, as of now, in my view, is not explicit. Okay? And finally, another reason why I think studying this question is interesting is that daily decisions are often non-binary. Okay? Notwithstanding, they share significant attributes of criminal adjudication. Here I should perhaps say daily decisions in my life, rather than attempting to make a general claim about how people decide in their own lives, because I don't have data for that. But I want to take a short break and read you a short vignette of family life that gives you a sense of what decisions I'm talking about.
And this also explains why there's a picture of my daughters on the slide. Because they actually are the protagonists of this little story. Okay, so if you bear with me, I'll read you this short vignette. So I am in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while my daughters play in their room. I hear one of them scream. By the way, I think all of you who are parents can probably relate to this. So I drop everything to go and check what's going on. Of course, always putting measures in place so that the pasta or risotto will not be overcooked. Having reached the room, I'm confronted with the following scenario and decision problem. One of my daughters is accusing the other of having done something wrong according to the family rules, and surely also other normative systems. Now, this may consist in taking a toy without the permission of the rightful owner, that is, the accuser. It may consist in pushing, in punching, etc., etc. I refer to the daughter who is accused precisely with the phrase, the accused. Now, you may think that this is somewhat unimaginative and perhaps excessive, but this is really a homage to the Scottish criminal justice system, where the defendant is indeed called the accused, and where, significantly for our purposes, there is an intermediate verdict. So often the accused does not deny the relevant conduct, but nonetheless denies responsibility. So she may claim, for example, that the toy was taken with the other's consent. Or the accused may even claim, showing a perceptive grasp of the rules of moral responsibility, that perhaps there wasn't consent, but that she believed in the other's consent, and that this alone excuses her conduct. In case of pushing or punching, the accused may claim that the punch or push was entirely accidental, and so on. Now, as an official of the family legal system, I'm called to adjudicate the dispute. The only evidence I can rely on consists in the words of my daughters. One accusing, and the other denying responsibility. Moreover, neither of my daughters has a significant track record for lying, so I do not have useful character evidence at my disposal. Now, if I had observed the scene, my epistemic situation would be very different. I would know whether the accused has indeed committed the alleged wrong or not, and I would act accordingly. I would punish her in case of knowledge of wrongdoing. Not to worry, punishments in my family are purely expressive in nature. In case of knowledge that there was no wrongdoing instead, I would simply go back to my cooking while stating that nothing wrong happened, and perhaps inviting my daughters to play kindly with each other. However, my actual epistemic situation is different. I have no knowledge of responsibility or of the lack thereof, because I did not observe the scene. So the evidence of responsibility is surely significant. For one thing, as I said earlier, the parties often agree that the relevant conduct took place, and they tend to disagree on the mental state, let's put it that way, the mens rea. Therefore, acting as if wrongdoing had not happened seems unwarranted. However, the incriminating evidence is not enough to act as if wrongdoing had happened. And in this situation, it seems rational to me to take an option that is intermediate between acting as if wrongdoing had happened and acting as if it had not happened. This intermediate option generally consists in asking for my daughter's attention for a couple of minutes, and in giving them, the accused especially, a short, non-accusatory speech on the importance of respecting the family rules, in particular the rule that was allegedly violated. If the accused has indeed done wrong, this short speech will serve as an opportunity to reconsider and possibly repent her actions. If she has not done wrong, it will do little to no harm to her, as well as to her sister, if their games are briefly disrupted for the sake of hearing some instructing words from their father. So, the example that I've just given you is one that I think shares some relevant characteristics of the criminal trial. Now, in both cases, the decision hinges on the probability of a particular, if complex, fact, which is the responsibility of an individual. In both cases, this fact, if it happened at all, happened in the past, such that fact-finding is backward-looking. And in both cases, decision-making is aimed at determining which is the appropriate response to an individual as a function of how strongly they are believed to have breached a relevant rule of conduct. Notwithstanding these shared characteristics, in a criminal trial, in most jurisdictions in the world, we use a binary system. In the example I've given you, I think it's rational for me to adopt an intermediate verdict when the evidence is as I've described in the example. Okay? So I think this mismatch in itself raises the question why in the criminal trial we do not do what may seem rational in everyday decision making, including decision making that is about attributing responsibility, attributing blame, if you will. So, I'll move on. As always, as I said earlier, please interrupt me if there's anything that you wish to be clarified. So now I'm going to go through the chapters very quickly. Okay. So chapter 1 studies intermediate verdicts in the history and in the present of law, and is especially focused on the debates that accompany these intermediate verdicts. Something that was very interesting, and perhaps not that surprising, but in studying these debates, is the fact that there's a huge overlap between them, notwithstanding that the jurisdictions involved are historically distant and also they're representative of different juridical cultures. So, first of all, I started with the intermediate verdicts of the jus commune criminal process. So here I'm referring to the criminal process that operated in continental Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern period. And the most famous intermediate verdict at the time is one that you're probably already familiar with, is extraordinary punishment, or pena extraordinaria, which could carry with it quite serious consequences, like corporal punishment, exile, the workhouse. Okay, so definitely not a mild intermediate verdict, but it was an intermediate verdict nonetheless, given the definition that I've presented at the start. Then I talk about the Italian acquittal per insufficienza di prove, which is considered to be a sort of a descendant of the jus commune intermediate verdicts. It was not as severe as the pena extraordinaria, obviously, but did carry with it some afflictive consequences. And by the way, it's not anymore part of the Italian criminal justice system because it was repealed with the reform of 1989. And finally, I discussed the Scottish not proven verdict, which has existed for nearly 300 years. It doesn't carry with it, I think this is a controversial point, but it doesn't have afflictive consequences that are comparable to the Italian intermediate verdict, and certainly not to the jus commune intermediate verdict. But it's said to carry with it considerable social stigma. Okay? Now, I don't know if you're following the current debate on the not proven verdict, but quite a lot of articles have been written recently by James Chalmers, Fiona Leverick, and Vanessa Munro, and they also carried out this very interesting jury research in 2019 with mock jurors that unveiled a lot of interesting things about the quite idiosyncratic jury system in Scotland, and also about not proven. I say idiosyncratic because I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Scotland the jury comprises 15 lay people rather than 12. And it decides on the basis of a simple majority. So, insofar as 8 of those jurors are in favor of conviction, then the defendant is convicted. And then on top of all this, they have this intermediate verdict. Now, there's now a bill in the Scottish Parliament that is not currently being discussed, but is stable for discussion. And this bill provides for the elimination of not proven. So chances are that maybe the intermediate verdict in Scotland will not exist for much longer. But I should also say that when I was talking to the Scottish colleagues about a year ago, they were pretty confident that the not proven verdict would have been abrogated sometime soon, and a year has passed and it's still there. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if in fact it took a bit longer for not proven to be eliminated. In terms of the debates, as I said, there's a big overlap. I think, perhaps the most significant overlap has to do with the argument according to which intermediate criminal verdicts are not compatible with the presumption of innocence, which is an argument that play a fundamental role in the Italian, in the repeal of the Italian intermediate verdict, and played a fundamental role in the Scottish debate. So I deal with these arguments in chapter 2, and I dedicate a full chapter to that, a bit cheekily, because, well, in a way, I think it is the most powerful argument that has been put forward against the intermediate verdict. But also, I was very keen to develop my theory of the presumption of innocence, and so I thought, well, I'm going to use a chapter for that. And in fact, chapter 2 is really for me an opportunity to develop a theory of the meaning and of the justification of the presumption of innocence that I originally presented in a separate paper. Sorry, I know this sounds very self-centered, but I'm going to mention this paper, which was published in 2020 in the Modern Law Review. Maybe some of you have read it. If you have read it and you're interested, then my suggestion is to actually look at the book, because I think what's in the book improves greatly what is in the paper, and actually I've changed my mind a bit about something that was in the paper. So my recommendation is look at the book if you're interested in that theory. Now, as it often happens with the debate on intermediate criminal verdicts, the arguments tend to be very terse. They tend to be more claim than arguments. And this is certainly true for the incompatibility between these verdicts and the presumption of innocence. You will often find claims to the effect that the presumption of innocence is logically incompatible with, but no argument is given for this conclusion. Okay? So my goal in chapter 2 was that of, first of all, putting the argument in its best possible light. So creating an argument on the basis of the material available in the literature, and making it as strong as it can possibly be, and then computing that argument. Okay? So the argument that I start with roughly goes as follows. The presumption of innocence includes a rule of treatment, according to which a defendant or a suspect should be treated as innocent until they're proven guilty. Okay, this is very straightforward. Issuing an intermediate criminal verdict is not treating someone as innocent. Therefore, intermediate criminal verdicts are, by definition, incompatible with the presumption of innocence because they are always issued in the absence of proof of guilt. As I said earlier, the standard of proof for an intermediate verdict has to be lower than proof of guilt, otherwise the verdict is not intermediate. Okay? So this is roughly the argument. And what I do in the rest of the chapter is try to compute this argument, and in order to be able to do that, first I present what is my view of the presumption of innocence. So I'm going to give you the conclusions of my argument. For the full argument, you have to read the chapter, or you can ask questions later. What I would like to do here is mainly to make sure that the conclusions are as clear as possible. But obviously, there's a lot of work that goes beyond the conclusions, behind the conclusions. Sorry. So, my understanding of the presumption of innocence is that it is an expression of a principle of rationality in argumentation, the principle of inertia, and as a result, the presumption has two components. One is the core component of the presumption of innocence, which is universally recognized, which is that the burden of proof is on criminal justice authorities, and the other one is the rule of treatment. Okay. To spell out these two components, I mean, the first component says that it is for the criminal justice authorities to give sufficient reasons for any alteration of the status quo of innocence. I'm going to stop here. I can say more about what I mean by it. And the rule of treatment instead says that in the absence of sufficient reasons for an alteration, the alteration is impermissible. Okay? So you cannot treat the defendant in accordance with that proposed alteration if you have not given sufficient reasons for it. But if the presumption of innocence is understood in this way, or in the way I do, it only safeguards formal but not moral correctness of trial argumentation. Okay, and I'll explain in a moment what do I mean by this. So the presumption of innocence completely defers to the legislator regarding permissible treatments and related evidentiary standards. So an example to clarify this conclusion. Let us imagine that the legislator provides that a relatively minor offense, say a common assault, is punishable by the death penalty. Okay? And the legislator also provides that in order to prove that that offense was committed, it is sufficient to satisfy a relatively low standard of proof, say the preponderance of the evidence standard. Okay? As I construe the presumption of innocence, the presumption has nothing to say against these choices of the legislators. The legislator, notwithstanding that, in my view, these choices are immoral. Okay? They're not incompatible with the presumption of innocence as I construe it, but the choices are nonetheless immoral. However, the presumption of innocence does put some conditions on the argumentation at trial, and these conditions are precisely these two. So first of all, it will have to be for the prosecution to provide sufficient evidence to satisfy that relatively low standard of proof. Okay? Secondly, if sufficient evidence is not provided, the penalty, that penalty, is impermissible. Okay? And importantly, because the presumption of innocence is an expression of a principle of rationality, if trial argumentation does not respect these two conditions, the charge is one of irrationality. So the criminal justice authorities can be charged with irrationality, not mere unreasonableness. And I think this is quite important. A charge of irrationality is a particularly serious one. So if we understand the presumption of innocence in these terms, and I hope at least I've succeeded in clarifying up to a point what do I mean by the presumption of innocence. But as I said, more in the chapter. Well, there can be no incompatibility between the presumption of innocence and an intermediate criminal verdict. Because if the presumption of innocence entirely defers to the choices of the legislator in terms of which treatment is possible, and what standard of proof needs satisfying for that treatment, then intermediate verdicts are absolutely fine. All that the presumption of innocence would say is that once the legislator has provided that an intermediate verdict is applicable and has set a standard for that, these two conditions are respected: burden of proof and impermissibility in the absence of sufficient reasons, where obviously sufficiency is in terms of the standard of proof that has been selected. One thing I would like to say is that one can answer the question of compatibility between the presumption and intermediate verdicts in other ways, obviously depending on how they construe the presumption of innocence. And even if you construe the presumption of innocence by, say, including a standard of proof as part of the presumption, or a particular way of regarding the defendant, so a sort of as including a cognitive attitude with which the fact finder should start the trial, even if you construe it in this way, I think it is still possible to argue for the compatibility between the presumption and intermediate verdicts. And I talk about this in the book. I mean, there's a very lengthy footnote in which I kind of explain that even if you construe the presumption of innocence in other ways, it does not follow that the presumption is incompatible with intermediate verdicts. Okay? Let us assume that I've shown that the presumption of innocence and intermediate verdicts are compatible. Okay? Obviously, this doesn't mean that I have justified intermediate verdicts. It only means that I've removed an obstacle to their justification. Okay? So the positive justification has yet to be given. And this is what I attempt to do in chapter 4. Okay? But I have to say something about chapter 3 first, because in chapter 4 I rely on decision theory to provide a justification for an intermediate criminal verdict. And decision theory, as some of you know, is a theory of decision making according to which the agent should act so as to maximize expected value. Now, because decision theory is focused on the expected value of the likely consequences of one's conduct, it is often assumed that only consequentialists about punishment can employ decision theory as a tool to determine whether punishment is justified or not. A consequentialist about punishment is someone who argues that justification for punishment depends entirely on the value of the likely consequences of punishment. Okay? So, decision theory focuses on the consequences. Consequentialism about punishment and about morality in general focuses on the consequences. Therefore, it would seem that obviously the consequentialist can use decision theory. But what about the deontologist about punishment? The deontologist about punishment is someone who argues that the likely consequences of punishment matter, but also there are a number of principles or rules that should be followed, even if by following them we do not maximize value. So in other words, these are rules that depart from the logic of value maximization. I mean, a classic example, a deontologist would say, you should not punish someone who you know is innocent. Okay? This is one of those rules. You should never breach this rule, even if by punishing you could maximize value. Okay? So this is the idea. So decision theory doesn't seem to work for a deontologist, precisely because deontologists wish to follow also these norms that do not conform with the logic of value maximization. However, my desire is to make the justification of intermediate verdicts in Chapter 4 as accessible as possible, as open to endorsement as possible. So I would not want to preclude the possibility that a deontologist endorses that justification. And so my attempt in Chapter 3 is that of showing that whether you're a consequentialist or a deontologist about punishment, you can, indeed, you should rely on decision theory in designing criminal adjudication. Okay? So this is what I try to do in chapter 3. So, I mean, obviously, the person here is Immanuel Kant, archetypal deontologist about punishment. So, decision theory is presented as a rational tool for selecting the standard of proof and also for selecting the verdict system. Should we have binary or should we have an intermediate verdict? Okay? And then I show that, or attempt to show that both consequentialists and deontologists about the justification of punishment can and indeed should make use of it. Just roughly, how does the argument work? Let's focus on the deontologist. The point that I make there is that you can identify some deontological rules of the kind that I described earlier, so rules that someone should follow, even if by following them they do not maximize value. There's also another type of rule which is called permission, but I leave this aside. Once you have identified plausible deontological rules about punishment, it is possible to give an argument that shows that if you follow decision theory in criminal adjudication, decision theory will lead you to exactly the same result that you would achieve if you were to follow those deontological rules. So this is roughly what the argument is about. Okay? So that a deontologist about punishment can safely follow the decision theory without fear that they would end up breaching their deontological rules. Okay? So now I come to chapter 4, in which as I said, I employ decision theory to give a justification for intermediate verdicts. And I start with the famous decision theoretical argument for the selection of the standard of proof that was first put forward by John Kaplan in a seminal paper from 1968. And then it's been sort of fleshed out by other scholars like D.K., Lauder, and Davidquist. So I start from that. And on the basis of that, I identify what I call the superiority condition of the intermediate verdict, which is this formula, this inequality here. I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but let me just drop a footnote. I'm not a mathematician. I feel I'm very poor at mathematics. It was very interesting. It was very interesting for me to engage in this project and get out of my comfort zone, try to employ a tool that I wasn't particularly familiar with. I'm saying all this just because I don't want you to be scared by this chapter if formulas are not your bread and butter. It's really all pretty simple, okay? And I actually realized that I don't think I sent you the appendix, so maybe I'll send you the appendix as well, just in case anyone wants to have a look. So this is the superiority condition. What is the superiority condition? It's basically the condition that an intermediate verdict would have to be satisfied, for it to be justified to adopt this intermediate verdict. In other words, to enrich the binary system with this intermediate verdict. And this condition basically has to do with the values, or to where the values of issuing this intermediate verdict against the innocent and against the guilty, respectively, would fall in a complete value function for the problem of criminal adjudication. Anyway, my next step is that of giving a verbal translation of this. Okay, because obviously that's just a formula, and it's not particularly helpful if the goal is that of identifying a concrete intermediate verdict that could potentially satisfy. So I try to give a verbal translation of it, which I call the heuristic translation for reasons that I explain in the book. Basically what I mean is that the verbal translation is not really equivalent to the formula. I think when you try to translate an algebraic formula into words, something is always lost in translation, and this inevitably happens here. So that's why I call it that way. So what is the verbal translation? The verbal translation is as follows. An intermediate verdict will satisfy the superiority condition insofar as it consists in hard treatment, or in treatment that is harder if the person receiving it is guilty than if they are innocent. So this is the verbal formulation. So it requires this differential treatment. So if you inflict the verdict against a guilty person, you inflict harder treatment than if you were to inflict it against an innocent person. Okay? And then the next step is to identify a concrete intermediate verdict that satisfies this condition. And this is what I call conditional acquittal, which is nothing but an acquittal which allows for a retrial if incriminating evidence with substantial probative value is found. So, why would this satisfy the condition that I've just given you? The full argument is in the chapter, but in a nutshell the point is this. If the defendant is guilty, it will be more likely that we come across the evidence that would allow us to retry the defendant than if they are innocent. Okay, so this is why it would satisfy the condition. So effectively, this intermediate verdict imposes an expected cost, which is the likelihood of a new trial. But this expected cost is greater if you're guilty, because the likelihood of a new trial is greater if you're guilty than if you're innocent, because the chances of finding the requisite evidence are greater. Okay, so this is the argument. This is just a graph. There are some graphs in the chapter which I find very helpful, to be honest, but and I hope you will too. But it depicts basically a verdict system where that also includes an intermediate verdict that satisfies the superiority condition. Okay. I mean, I can illustrate the graph in more detail, but I think it will suffice for now. So we come to the last chapter, and then I'm done. And thanks for your patience. So I said this chapter is perhaps the only one that is not self-contained. So I think in order to make full sense of this chapter, you might have to have read other parts of the book. But maybe this is not even that true. So what I do in this chapter is I try to respond to possible objections to either the use of the decision theoretic model in general, or the notion of an intermediate verdict and its adoption in the criminal process. And there are more objections than the one I'm going to talk about, but I illustrate just a few. Now, obviously, with respect to the decision theoretic model, there's the classic objection that it cannot really be implemented for a number of reasons. It would require that fact finders are able to work with probabilities, that, if the standard of proof is a probability threshold, fact finder will be able to tell whether the evidence meets the threshold or not. But it also requires the construction of a value function, which is a numerical interval scale, and there are doubts as to whether this can be achieved. Okay? So what I try to do here is to try and assuage those doubts. I mean, the main point I make there is that, especially for what concerns the value function in our everyday life, and especially in our academic life, I say, we make very similar numerical evaluation, and therefore, why shouldn't we be able to do this in the context of a criminal trial? Another objection is that the decision theoretic model cannot capture some systemic effects. So, what is peculiar about employing decision theory, in the way I do at least, is that you take a token case, so a representative case, you apply decision theory to it, and you figure out, how decision making should be structured so as to maximize expected value. And then what you do is you take everything that you have sort of determined or figured out through that analysis, and then you apply it across the board. So you apply it also to other cases. Okay? Now the risk of doing this is that you never get a view of the system as a whole. You always work on token cases. And this, one might say, is problematic because if you make a change like the introduction of an intermediate verdict, there could be some effects on the system as a whole that you would not be able to detect if you only look at the token case. Example, someone could say, if you introduce an intermediate verdict, many more cases are going to be brought to trial. Why? Because it would be easier for the prosecution to obtain a desirable result than it is under the current system. And so the prosecution, at least in systems where the prosecution has discretion, like England and Wales, will bring more cases to trial. This is a systemic effect that the decision theoretic model cannot capture. Okay? So I talk about effects of this kind and whether we should worry or not about them. Another set of objection has to do with the fact that there are some devices in the legal system and the criminal justice system in particular that could be said to be analogous to an intermediate verdict. And we already employ them. So someone could say, well, why introducing a new device when we could just, potentiate the devices we currently have? Typical example is that of the synergy between civil cases and criminal cases. And the classic case here is that of O.J. Simpson. He was acquitted in a criminal court, but then for the very same facts, he was condemned to pay damages in a civil court. Doesn't that synergy work the same way as an intermediate verdict would? I think it doesn't, but someone could raise an objection. Another example that has to do with substantive criminal law is the case of lesser included offences. So, at least in England and Wales, to commit robbery, you need to have committed theft as well. So robbery is nothing but theft plus violence or threat of violence. So we say that theft is the lesser included offense. So one could, and it often happens, as a prosecutor, could charge the defendant with both theft and robbery, okay? If they are unable to prove violence or threat of violence, but they're able to prove all the other elements of theft, well, the defendant will be convicted of theft, the lesser included offense. The penalty will be more limited, but nonetheless, they will receive criminal punishment. Someone could argue that this substantive law regime is very similar to having an intermediate criminal verdict, in the sense that with lesser evidence, with weaker evidence, you're still able to issue a sanction. Again, so I talk about that. And finally, and this is an argument that actually played a significant role in the Scottish debate, is the idea that intermediate verdicts can work as a cop-out. So the worry there, and there's a bit of empirical evidence showing that mock jurors see intermediate verdicts this way, is that if you are a juror and you're presented with a case that involves a difficult decision, but is likely to involve lengthy deliberation in the jury room, and the jury splits, so some argue that the defendant should be acquitted, some argue the defendant should be convicted, it is possible that the presence of an intermediate verdict will be used as a way out, as a sort of a solution of compromise, where the jurors say, well, let's not spend hours discussing this case, it's pointless, let's just decide straight away that we're going to issue an intermediate verdict. And this is seen as problematic because obviously it's not an instance of virtuous decision making. So jurors are effectively not living up to the responsibility to adjudicate the case thoroughly. Okay? So this is another objection that I discuss in the chapter. Great. I'm really finishing now. So the book contains several claims with related arguments that are far from obvious. Why would I write it otherwise? And it goes without saying that, I mean, if you read it, you will possibly find the book where some arguments are unpersuasive. I have no doubts that I will persuade very few people. I'm not even sure I'll persuade it myself, to be honest. So, what matters to me is to raise a question and stimulate a reflection. As I said, I really care about overcoming this dogmatism. Even if the outcome is, you know, a bulletproof justification for what we currently have for the binary system, I think something will have been gained in the process because this justification will have been made explicit, whereas now it's not. Okay, thank you.